She was there one moment, and then she wasn't. No goodbye, no warning, no note on the kitchen table. Nancy Guthrie, a mother, a neighbor, a woman everyone in her small town described as the kind of person who remembers your birthday, vanished without a single trace on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Her car was still in the driveway. Her coffee was still warm on the counter. Her dog was sitting by the front door like he was waiting for her to come back in. She never did. For months, investigators had nothing. No leads, no suspects, no answers for the family who kept the porch light on every single night, just in case. The town held its breath. Her husband gave press conferences with hollow eyes and shaking hands. Her daughter, only 9 years old, drew pictures of her mom and taped them to the living room window facing the street. And then, just days ago, the FBI released something. Evidence so specific, so shocking, so completely unexpected that it didn't just reopen this case. It blew it wide open. What they found raises questions that go far beyond a missing persons report. Questions about the people closest to Nancy. Questions about what was really happening behind the closed doors of that quiet house on Maple Creek Road. Questions that, once you hear the answers, you will not be able to stop thinking about. Stay right here, because this story is not what anyone thought it was. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the day Nancy disappeared. Before that. Because that's where the real story starts. And that's the part the news cycle never slows down enough to tell you. Nancy Guthrie, 41, lived in Cedarville, a town of roughly 12 Souders-aren't people, tucked between farmland and forest in the Midwest. The kind of town where people wave at strangers from their front porches. Where the diner on Main Street has had the same menu since 1987. Where everyone knows everyone. And everyone knew Nancy. She'd lived there her whole life. Went to Cedarville High. Married her high school sweetheart, Daniel Guthrie, at 23. Had a daughter, Emma, in 2015. Worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local hardware store. Volunteered at the church food pantry on Saturday mornings. By every visible measure, her life was ordinary. Stable. Good. But people who knew her well, really well, say the last 8 months before she disappeared, something had shifted. She was quieter. More careful with her words. Friends noticed she'd stopped coming to the monthly book club she'd attended for 6 years without missing a single meeting. She'd declined 2 invitations to birthday dinners. One close friend described a phone call where Nancy seemed to start saying something important, then stopped herself. Said, "Never mind, it's nothing." It wasn't nothing. Her neighbor, Carol Mead, told investigators she'd seen Nancy sitting in her car in the driveway at midnight one night, just sitting there, lights off, not on her phone, just staring. When Carol knocked on the window to check if she was okay, Nancy smiled, that warm, reliable Nancy smile, and said she was just thinking, just needed some air. Carol said she looked like someone carrying something heavy, the kind of heavy you can't put down. 3 weeks after that conversation, Nancy was gone. And as investigators would slowly, painstakingly discover over the following months, that weight Nancy was carrying had a shape, a name, a secret that someone very close to her had worked extremely hard to keep buried. Until the FBI found it. Tuesday, October 14th. 7:43 a.m. That's the last confirmed timestamp anyone has of Nancy Guthrie being alive. A security camera at the end of her street, one of those doorbell cameras on a neighbor's porch, caught her walking to the mailbox. Gray hoodie, hair pulled back. She stood at the mailbox for a moment, looked down at whatever was in her hand, and then looked up. Looked directly at the camera, and then walked back inside. That was it. That was the last image anyone has of her. By 3 p.m. that same day, her husband Daniel reported her missing. He told police he'd been at work all day, came home to find her car in the driveway, the front door unlocked, coffee half finished on the counter, and no sign of Nancy anywhere in the house. He said he called her phone multiple times. It went straight to voicemail. He assumed at first that she'd walked to a friend's house or stepped out for a walk and lost track of time. But Nancy always answered her phone. Always. So he called her best friend, Diane. Then her sister in Columbus. Then 2 neighbors. Nobody had heard from her. He called the police at 3:22 p.m. Now, here's where something starts to feel off. Officers who responded to the initial call reported that Daniel Guthrie was calm but concerned. That's how it was logged, which on its own means nothing. People process shock in different ways. Some people go completely still. But one of the responding officers, in a statement given months later, said something about that evening stuck with him. He asked Daniel if he and Nancy had argued recently. Standard question. Routine. Daniel said no. Immediately. No hesitation. But then, and the officer noted this specifically, Daniel looked at the floor when he said it. Just for a second. Then back up. The officer filed it away. Didn't think much of it that night. He thought about it a lot later. Because what investigators were about to uncover in the weeks that followed would make that single moment, that one look at the floor, feel like the crack in the wall you should have seen before everything collapsed. The first 72 hours of a missing persons case are everything. Law enforcement will tell you that. The window of finding someone alive narrows fast. And in Nancy's case, those first 72 hours were a blur of search parties, interviews, and a community that showed up in a way that made national news. Over 300 volunteers turned out the first weekend. They searched the woods behind the neighborhood. They walked the riverbank. They put flyers in every gas station, pharmacy, and grocery store within a 40-mile radius. Nothing. No physical evidence. No witnesses beyond the doorbell camera footage. No cell phone activity after 7:43 a.m. Her credit cards went untouched. Her bank account showed no withdrawals. It was as if Nancy Guthrie had simply ceased to exist. The FBI was brought in by the end of week 2. And when federal investigators arrived, they did something local police hadn't done with quite the same depth. They looked at Daniel, not because he was the obvious suspect. In cases like this, spouses are always examined closely. It's standard procedure. But because when the FBI sat down with him for a more formal interview, things didn't add up the way they should have. His account of that Tuesday was clean. Too clean. He'd been at work from 8 to 5. He had colleagues who confirmed it. He had badge swipe records. There were no gaps in his alibi that investigators could immediately point to. But there were gaps in his story. Small ones. The kind most people wouldn't catch. He said he last spoke to Nancy the night before, Monday evening, at dinner. Said everything was normal. Said she seemed fine. But Nancy's phone records told a different story. At 11:47 p.m., Monday night, while Daniel claimed they were both asleep, Nancy's phone had connected to a cell tower 3 miles from their home. She had left the house, in the middle of the night, and gone somewhere. The question that kept investigators awake was simple. Where? And why? The cell tower ping opened a door investigators hadn't expected to find. If Nancy's phone was 3 miles from home at midnight, and Daniel had no knowledge of it, then either Daniel was lying, or Nancy had been keeping something from him, or both. FBI digital forensics pulled Nancy's phone records going back 8 months, and what they found was a pattern. A quiet, consistent pattern that told the story of a woman living 2 separate lives in the same body. Starting in late February, Roughly 8 months before her disappearance, Nancy had begun making regular calls to an unregistered number, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more, always late at night, always after 10 p.m., always under 12 minutes long. Investigators traced the number through a series of prepaid devices. It took weeks, but they got there. The number belonged to a man named Robert Kane, 38 years old, lived 40 miles away in the next county. No criminal record, self-employed contractor, divorced. FBI agents drove out to speak with him on a quiet Thursday morning. He answered the door, took one look at the badges and said, before they'd asked a single question, "I've been wondering when you'd come." He knew Nancy. He knew her well. He said they'd been friends for 3 years, having met through a mutual contact. He said their relationship was not romantic, a claim investigators examined carefully, but that Nancy had reached out to him in February because she was scared. Not of a stranger, of someone inside her own home. Robert Kane said that over those 8 months of calls, Nancy had described a situation at home that had been escalating quietly and consistently. Small things at first, then larger ones, then things she said she couldn't talk about on a regular phone. He said the last time he spoke to her, the call at 11:47 p.m. the night before she vanished, she had said 5 words that he hadn't been able to get out of his head since. 5 words. He repeated them to investigators slowly, like each one had weight. "I think he knows everything." Those 5 words hit investigators like a door swinging open in a dark hallway. Because if Nancy believed Daniel had discovered something she'd been hiding or protecting, then the timeline of her disappearance shifted completely. This wasn't random. This wasn't a woman who wandered away or made a sudden choice to start over somewhere new. This was a woman who was afraid, and then disappeared. FBI agents went back to Daniel Guthrie with new questions, harder ones, and this time his composure, that steady, grieving husband composure he'd maintained through every press conference and community vigil, started to show cracks. He denied knowing Robert Kane. Then investigators showed him the call logs. He changed his answer, said he had found the number on Nancy's phone months ago and confronted her about it. Said she'd told him it was just a friend. Said he believed her. But phone records from Daniel's own device told a different story. 2 days before Nancy disappeared, Daniel had called Robert Kane's number himself. The call lasted 4 minutes. When investigators confronted him with this, Daniel went completely silent for a long moment. Then he asked for a lawyer. In the investigation world, that silence lands like a thunderclap. Meanwhile, the FBI was executing a search warrant on the Guthrie home. Not the first search. Local police had walked through early in the investigation. But a forensic search. The kind where they pull up floorboards, where they luminol every surface, where they spend 3 days going through a house millimeter by millimeter. And on the second day of that search, in the detached garage behind the house, in a space behind a false wall that had been recently constructed, they found something that changed the entire nature of this case. Something so unexpected, so deliberately hidden, that it reframed every single thing investigators thought they knew. And before I tell you exactly what was inside that wall, you need to understand what Nancy had discovered about her own husband. Because without that context, what came next won't make complete sense. Behind that false wall in the garage, FBI investigators found a fireproof lockbox. Inside, a burner phone, $14, $8 in cash, 2 forged identification documents, and a handwritten list of names, 7 in total, with dollar amounts next to each one. None of the names matched Daniel Guthrie's known associates. None were connected to anything in his official life as a mid-level project manager at a logistics company. But the burner phone, once forensic analysts cracked it, contained a 2-year text conversation that revealed something investigators had not anticipated. Daniel Guthrie had been operating a side business, not a legal one. He had been functioning as a broker, a middleman, in a financial fraud network. Fake investment returns, real victims, real money funneled through a web of shell accounts. The scale was significant. FBI financial crimes analysts estimated the operation had moved close to $3 million over 18 months. Nancy had found out. Investigators pieced together the timeline using her calls to Robert Kane. Approximately 6 months before she disappeared, Nancy had stumbled onto a document on the family computer. A financial ledger that didn't match any business Daniel had ever told her about. She hadn't confronted Daniel immediately. She was scared. She needed time to understand what she was looking at. She called Robert Kane because she needed someone outside the situation. Someone safe. Someone who could help her figure out what to do. For months, she gathered information quietly. Documents, screenshots, amounts, names. She was building something, a record, evidence. She had emailed a compressed file to a private account the morning of October 14th at 7:31 a.m., 12 minutes before the last camera footage of her alive. The FBI retrieved that email and opened the file. Inside were 87 documents, enough to prosecute, enough to put multiple people away for a very long time. Nancy had known exactly what she was doing that morning. She was making sure the truth couldn't be buried along with her. 4 months after Nancy vanished, Daniel Guthrie was arrested. The charges were serious. Federal fraud charges related to the financial scheme, and based on the evidence compiled from the lockbox, the burner phone, the timeline, and his own changing statements, a charge of suspected involvement in Nancy's disappearance. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea on all counts. He was denied bail given the evidence of forged documents and significant cash, which the judge ruled indicated flight risk. The community of Cedarville reacted the way small towns do when the ground shifts beneath them. Shock, denial, and then a slow, awful settling into a new reality. The man who had organized search parties for his missing wife. The man who had cried in front of cameras. The man whose daughter had taped her mother's drawings to the window. Had known more than he ever said. And a town that had believed in him completely was left to figure out how to hold that truth. Here is the hardest part of this entire story. Nancy Guthrie has not been found, despite the arrest, despite the evidence, despite everything the FBI uncovered behind that false wall and inside that lockbox. Nancy herself remains missing. Investigators believe they know what happened. The evidence points in a direction that is devastating. But belief and proof are not the same thing, and until Nancy is found, her family lives in a specific, terrible in-between. Her sister in Columbus has taken in Emma, the 9-year-old who drew pictures of her mom. Emma still draws them. The FBI has not closed the search. Multiple sites connected to the financial network have been identified and are being examined. Investigators remain active and say new information continues to come in as the fraud case unfolds and individuals connected to the network begin to cooperate. The search goes on, and every single day that passes without answers is another day that family carries a weight no family should ever have to carry. The people who loved Nancy Guthrie want her story told right. Not as a crime statistic, not as a case number, as a person. Diane, her best friend, gave a statement last week that has been shared tens of thousands of times. She described Nancy as someone who laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, who kept a running list of books she wanted to read and always had a recommendation ready, who once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to sit with a friend who'd just gotten bad news because she couldn't stand the idea of that person sitting alone. She was the kind of person, Diane wrote, who made you feel like you mattered, just by the way she listened to you. That is who is missing. That is whose story deserves to be heard. And that is the person this case, beneath all the evidence and courtrooms and legal proceedings, is really about. Nancy's case has done something beyond its own tragedy. It has put a spotlight on how many people, mostly women, but not only women, are living inside situations that look completely fine from the outside. Situations where fear keeps them silent, where the person closest to them is also the person they're most afraid of. Robert Kane has spoken publicly since the arrest. He said he replays their last conversation constantly. Said he told her to get out sooner. Said she told him she needed more time. Needed the evidence to be complete. She was protecting other people from what she'd uncovered, even at the end. Advocates for missing persons and domestic abuse survivors have cited Nancy's case as a painful example of why systems need to be better, why the signs need to be taken more seriously, why "she seemed fine" should never be the last word on anyone's story. As of this week, Daniel Guthrie's trial date has been set. Federal prosecutors have described the case as one of the most thoroughly documented they've seen at the preliminary stage, largely due to the 87 documents Nancy herself compiled and sent that final morning. She knew. She planned. She made sure there would be a record even if she couldn't be there to speak. Whatever the outcome of the trial, one thing is already true. Nancy Guthrie refused to let the truth disappear with her. She left a trail of evidence through sheer courage and careful, quiet planning. And because of that, people who hurt her and others will face consequences. The search for Nancy physically continues. Her porch light is still on. Emma still draws pictures. And a town that thought it knew everything about itself is learning, slowly and painfully, that sometimes the most important stories are the ones happening behind the quietest doors. If Nancy's story moved you, share this video. Someone out there needs to see it. Drop a comment with her name so the algorithm knows this story matters. Like the video to keep it reaching people. Nancy made sure the truth survived. The least we can do is make sure her story is heard.